Hi there, folks.
Oh, am I on? Oh, yeah, I am. We good? Good afternoon. Nice to see such a big crowd here this afternoon. I'm Bill Harris, the director here at the FDR Library, and I am really happy to be here with Bill Bleyer to talk about his book, The Roosevelts in New York City. I'll do a little housekeeping to begin with. I'd like to welcome our virtual audience as well as those who'll be watching on C-SPAN later. We really appreciate them being here today. And what we're going to do is we're going to be in a conversation for a bit, and then we'll open up for some questions. Mike is to my right, to your left over here, if you have questions when we get to that point. And then afterwards, Bill will be signing his books in the lobby, so he'll join us for that as well. So now, Bill Bleyer. He's a prize-winning staff reporter for Newsday, the Long Island newspaper, many of you know, for 33 years, before retiring in 2014 to write books. What a wonderful retirement, to retire and write books. And freelance for newspapers and magazines. He's the co-author with Harrison Hunt of Long Island in the Civil War, but also then he's turned to the Roosevelt, Sagamore Hill, Theodore Roosevelt's summer White House. We do let Sagamore Hill people here in Hyde Park, so you're welcome here. Other works including George Washington's Long Island Spy Ring, The Sinking of the Steamboat Lexington on Long Island Sound, and Fire Island Lighthouse, Long Island's welcoming beacon. Well, welcome.
Thank you,
Bill.
Thank you.
And we look forward to talking today about the Roosevelts in New York City. So first, I always like to ask, how did you come to this story? What led you to not only the Sagamore Hill Roosevelts, but the Roosevelts in total and in New York City?
Well, basically, I grew up on Long Island, not far from Sagamore Hill, and started going there when I was maybe 5 or 6, fascinated by the house. When you walk in, you see the elephant tusks by the north room when you're a kid, and you see all the animal trophies, and your mouth just drops. And I always tell people I've never seen any other house of any major public official that so speaks of that person as Sagamore Hill. And I became a history junkie when I was tiny. Loved national park sites, anything historical. And when I would go to National Historic Sites, I would always buy the book, if there was a book on that site, Eastern National, which still prints the books about the parks. If they had one, any place I went, I would buy it for my collection. And they never did Sagamore Hill. And I kept asking, when are they going to do a book on Sagamore Hill? And then I ended up being a weekly editor in Oyster Bay, and then eventually got to Newsday, and I covered that area, and I covered the Roosevelts in particular. So I became the head of the Oyster Bay branch at the time, declared I was the official Roosevelt reporter, which gave me all kinds of inroads to things. Got to cover the commissioning of the USS Theodore Roosevelt down in Norfolk. And because the family kept praising me, the Navy invited me out for 24 hours during sea trials to be on the carrier, land on the deck while they were at sea. But I kept asking, the whole time, was like, when's somebody going to write the full history of Sagamore Hill? And nobody did. And at one point, the curator who was about to retire had always told me she was going to write the full history of Sagamore Hill. And then when she retired, she said, I'm tired of this place. I'm going back home to Pennsylvania, and why don't you write it? So I did. So that was my first book on my own after writing the Civil War book with a co-author. And after that was published, I went into Theodore Roosevelt birthplace in the city, and I was looking around their little bookstore, and I was like, half seriously, half kidding the Rangers, why don't you carry my book? Which they started to do. And then I said, why isn't there any book on Theodore Roosevelt birthplace? And they said, we would love it for visitors and staff and volunteers, but nobody's ever done it. And sort of half as a joke, I said, well, maybe I'll write it. And then I mentioned it to my publisher, and he said, yeah, why don't you do that? But broaden it to be both branches of the family, primarily the birthplace and Roosevelt House, which is where Franklin, Sarah, and Eleanor lived before Franklin and Eleanor went to the White House. And then I decided to broaden it more and say, well, let me catalog and write the history of every structure or site in the city with any Roosevelt connection whatsoever. So basically, this is the first book to talk about the birthplace in any depth, but also, look where they went, where they worked, where they went to church, where they were educated, the parks in their memory, or anything Roosevelt. So it actually kind of became a sort of a unique project.
Well, I think what's interesting, and what a lot of people I don't think realize, is that the Roosevelts all, and when I speak of the Roosevelts right now, I'll speak of all of them, not just the Hudson Valley or the Oyster Bay. I'll make that distinction if necessary. That they're New Yorkers, that they're very much were New Yorkers, and a part of the city's history and its development, and lived large parts of their lives there. They weren't just out at Sagamore Hill or up here in the Hudson Valley. So how far back does that history go? I know it's the Dutch.
Yeah, it's definitely Dutch. I'm going to have a cheat sheet here because the family tree is a little complicated.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Just
so the first, what's interesting when you study the Roosevelts is they started out so humbly and ended up as one of the most prominent, important, famous families in America. But the first one to come over from Holland was Klaus Martens van Roosevelt in the 1640s. Nobody knows exactly what year. And he's a humble farmer. He ends up buying 50-acre farm on what's now 34th Street. And he's not only diminutive in importance, but in stature. In the actual city records at the time, they referred to him as Shorty. So he was not only not important, he was actually physically diminutive. But he starts this trend of the family expanding into business, politics, government. His son Nicholas builds a mill near the waterfront. He's elected an alderman in 1700, and he starts the family trend that continues for generations of being involved in civic affairs and government. But his mill near the waterfront starts to make the family more wealthy. Nicholas has two sons, Johannes, born in 1689, Jacobus, born in 1692, and Johannes becomes a merchant. He wrangles a monopoly on manufacturing linseed oil, which makes him richer. And he serves on several dozen municipal committees. And then he leads the family into real estate, and that's really ultimately where a lot of the money comes from. Then you have Isaac, who's the great-great-great-grandfather of FDR, born in 1726. He's the first Roosevelt to drop the van from the name and just become Roosevelt. And there's a great story that TR's uncle Robert has to instruct a newspaper editor in New York how to pronounce the name, because people have all these variations, Roosevelt and various things. And he writes this fairly funny letter saying it's Roosevelt, 3 syllables.
Not Roosevelt.
No, not Roosevelt. And then, so Isaac becomes a trader in sugar and rum, builds a sugar refinery on Wall Street, becomes a member of the New York Provincial Council in 1775, helps write the state's constitution 2 years later, and he gets involved in various business and governmental things, and then helps form New York City's first bank, the Bank of New York. And his partner in that venture is a little-known gentleman named Alexander Hamilton. Then you have Isaac's cousin James founds Roosevelt and Son hardware business on Maiden Lane down by Wall Street, and that really their business career takes off because they start out selling hardware, and then one of them has the great idea of importing plate glass from Europe, and this is a huge improvement over the wavy kind of historic glass you see in old houses, and they end up supplying plate glass for all the buildings being built as the country expands out to the west. Then you have Cornelius van Schack Roosevelt, the great-grandson of Johannes and the grandfather of TR. And he's the one who really moves into the plate glass business. And he's the first really shrewd businessman in the family. They're all doing pretty well. During the Panic of 1837, he buys up vacant land all over Manhattan and then sits on it. When the panic disappears, he starts selling off this land at huge profit. Then he forms a chemical bank to provide mortgages, to the people buying the land so they can build on it. So he's making money selling the lots and then providing mortgages. So he becomes the first millionaire in the family. When he dies out in Oyster Bay in 1871, it's the biggest probate estate in the history of New York City. And from there, the money just keeps growing. So, but they were all involved. Everybody from the early generations is involved in city government and state government, all kinds of civic activity. And then Theodore Sr., who's Cornelius's youngest son of 5, is the one who basically decides that all this money and importance really needs to transfer over to philanthropy. So he eventually weans himself from being vice president of the last business and becomes a full-time philanthropist. He helped start Orthopedic Hospital. He helps create the Museum of Art. The charter for the Museum of Natural History is actually signed in his living room. And he's known all over the city that he will invite people to the house, and his rich friends know they have to bring their checkbook because there's always some cause that Theodore will be hitting them up for. So,
how did the family, and we do always sort of bifurcate them and make this binary Hudson Valley versus Oyster Bay sort of distinction. How did the family sort of evolve into those sort of very different political views and approaches to the world, but they're both growing out of this New York City business world where they all achieve success?
Yeah, well, initially they were all in the city for the first couple of generations. Then one branch starts moving up into the Hudson Valley, and the other branch, Cornelius, TR's grandfather, discovers Oyster Bay as this quiet little backwater by Long Island Sound. Decides it's a great place to spend the summers, and because he's there, his friends start to go, and everybody's renting, and it becomes a resort. But they're all politically democratic, friendly until the Civil War comes along, and then all hell breaks loose, not only in the country but in the family, because a lot of them become Theodore Sr. and then his son, the future president. They all switch to Republicans because they want to support the effort to keep the Union intact and support Lincoln. And some of the Democratic Roosevelts become what they call Union Democrats to support the war effort, but they're still Democrats. But Theodore's uncle, who lives next door to the birthplace, remains a Democrat, and that's sort of after the war. Some of them go back to being Democrats, some stay Republicans, and it becomes rather fractious. And the interesting thing is that divide continued up into the 1980s, where the two branches couldn't get along. If they were in the same place, they'd have arguments. Sometimes they'd have physical altercations.
And there were personalities involved in some of it.
Yeah, well, yes.
Of course. Not just family history. Family history leads to personality.
Yeah, very strong personalities. I mean, Robert is actually one of my favorite Roosevelts. He's the black sheep of the family. I devote a whole chapter to him because he's not well known. But he's politically off in his own tangent. He's a reform Democrat congressman. But the reason the family didn't talk about him for generations is he was known in Manhattan for having affairs with women all over the place, and he would give them long green gloves that he'd buy wholesale at A.T. Stewart's department store. And all the women that he had affairs with would wear these gloves proudly to show that they had an affair with Robert Roosevelt. And to make things worse, he has a mistress who works for the liberal newspaper that he's editing, has an affair with one of his employees, then has a whole separate illegitimate family with her, and sets them up around the corner in their own house. So Theodore Sr. and Theodore Jr., the president, are very morally upright people and are horrified by this, and basically don't want to see him and talk about him, even though he's living right next door to the birthplace. And it's only in the 1980s that anybody would even talk about him. And I did a magazine piece for Newsday in the mid 80s about the black sheep of the Roosevelt family, And initially, the Roosevelts wouldn't even talk to me about him because he was such a horror story. But then P. James Roosevelt, who was the head of the Oyster Bay branch, said, he's such an interesting character. We have to talk about him. And he broke the ice. Very interesting family.
So, so the story of the Roosevelts is the story of New York as they move uptown,
Right.
and as the city changed. So that progression is reflected in their homes, where they live, and as time passes and enters into the Gilded Age, where they are very much the old families and not representatives of the new.
Yeah, well, the history of not only the Roosevelts, but the upper levels of society was the rule was when retail moved into your neighborhood, it was time to move uptown, and that started back with CVS was the first one to leave. Initially, the Roosevelt and Son business was on Maiden Lane, and they all lived in that neighborhood. And then the department stores started to develop up along Broadway, and CVS decided it was time to move uptown, and he built one of the nicest houses in the city because he was the first millionaire in the city. Built this really large brownstone on the corner of Broadway and 14th Street overlooking Union Square. And that house is famous because there's a famous photograph of young Theodore, age 6, his brother Elliot, age 4, looking out the window at Lincoln's funeral procession in 1865. It's a really kind of interesting snapshot of history. And he lived there. He bought houses for all of his sons when they were married. And Robert and Theodore were the two youngest, and they got side-by-side brownstones on East 20th Street. And they stayed there until the 1870s, and then A.T. Stewart's and all these large department stores are moving up Broadway. And following the trend, he said, it's time to go to West 57th Street. And that continued. And Sarah, Franklin's mother, does the same thing. Yeah. He's going to law school at Columbia. She buys a house down in the Murray Hill neighborhood to be near him when he's in law school. And retail is creeping up towards her house. She wants to move. They're living in a rented house called Draper House. And after they have the first two children, Sarah's horrified how they're crammed into this little house, and comes up with the idea of building twin townhouses on 65th Street, where she can be on one side and they'll be on the other side, not thinking how this is going to affect Eleanor, who's horrified. But that's the trend. So that's pretty much as far as they get up into the 60s.
And well, it's a good neighborhood still.
Yeah.
But the double house wasn't unique to Sarah, was it? The idea that you can build these side-by-side houses that are separate homes, but they're one unified unit, essentially, from a facade standpoint.
Yeah, well, she got the idea because Eleanor and Franklin are married at the twin homes of her cousin and godmother, which from the outside, and that house still exists. From the outside, it looks like one house, just like Roosevelt House did on 65th Street. And then you go in the doors, and there's two separate apartments.
The Parishes, or the
Parish
family?
Yeah.
Bank in New York as well, I believe.
Yeah, Susan Parish, and it was her cousin. So Sarah was at the wedding, obviously, and had the idea. So at Christmas 1905 or 1906, her Christmas present to Eleanor Franklin is a sketch on Hyde Park stationery showing her vision of this twin townhouse. So she hires an architect. She buys the two adjoining brownstones on 65th Street. And brownstones were out of favor, so she got something of a deal, tears them down, and then spends about $250,000 in money of that era, about $8 million today, to fulfill this dream. And it's a very nice building, but they're connected on two different floors across this central corridor area. And Eleanor was horrified because for 25 years, Sarah would show up in Franklin and Eleanor's apartment without warning, rearrange the furniture and furnishings. And Eleanor, had several episodes of breaking down, in frustration and tears, because she wasn't controlling her own life. She had to be controlled by her mother-in-law.
we we won't have the argument today, but we like Sarah here. Uh,
Oh, I love Sarah. She's a great character.
Great.
But and it's funny because in doing the research at Roosevelt House, Deborah Gardner, the curator who was helping me, said,
That's good.
"I hope you're not going to perpetuate the poor Eleanor, oh, woe is me, Eleanor story." And I said, "Well, if you read her autobiography, she's perpetuating that story as hell. I mean, she talks about a couple of weeks after moving into the twin things about breaking down, and Franklin comes to her and says, what's wrong with you?" And she says, I just can't be happy living in a house I had nothing to do with, have no control over, and it's not the way I want to live. So, I mean, Sarah was a fascinating character, but she was a strong-willed person.
She was very strong-willed.
And, and she certainly, tried to keep Franklin close at hand, physically as well as emotionally. So I don't dislike Sarah. I love strong women, but I do sympathize with Eleanor, how, trying to get out of her shadow.
Yeah. We're always struck too in that story by some of VR's comments about she wasn't prepared for motherhood. She didn't know what to do. And she sort of, in a way, left this vacuum that she was happy in a way that someone stepped in. It's just the person stepping in is a very strong personality stepping in.
Yeah, well, the beginning, in the autobiography, she talks about how wonderful it was because I was unprepared, as you said, I was unprepared to be a wife or a mother. And it was so wonderful that my mother-in-law stepped
She
in.
was happy to step in.
Hired the servants for when they got married in the rented house, picked out the linens, and she did confer with Eleanor on that. But Eleanor said, the only thing I said about the house was we wanted a telephone and we wanted the walls painted white, and she left everything else to Sarah happily.
Yeah.
But then once she got into the situation,
It's like
my favorite story is when they moved in. Eleanor put her favorite vase on one side of the mantle because it was had nice natural light.
Mm-hmm.
And the next day she went into the room and the two vases were switched. So she asked her husband and their kids, did anybody move them? And she asked the servants and everybody said no. And then she realized Sarah had done it. So Sarah came in and basically rearranged their side of the house and did that for 25 years. So
the house, though, that now it's Hunter College,
right.
Owns it, and it's fascinating to see around the era when, around the time Sarah dies, and they're trying to figure out, do we rent it if we can't sell it? And there's some wonderful descriptions. ER writes some letters of going in, and the place is kind of a mess. It needs a lot of updating, and it's very out of date, and needs a lot of work. So. What was that? I mean, that's, again, a New York story in the sense of during that era, these enormous homes by New York standards, certainly by any standard, you called it a building versus a house because they are buildings with elevator and infrastructure.
Right.
And, but they face this moment too of what do we do with this sort of New York place?
Well, the interesting thing was when Franklin and Eleanor go to the White House, Sarah's still there.
Yeah.
So Franklin wants to rent his side of the building, and nobody will rent it because they all quickly realize that Sarah is there, and they're going to have to deal with Sarah. And the buildings are, the two sides are connected, so it doesn't really work. And then when she dies, Franklin puts the house up for sale, and it's World War II, and nobody's pretty much thinking about buying houses. And then in 1942, they get Hunter College is around the corner. And Eleanor and Franklin both have a connection to Hunter College. Eleanor had spent time there with students, and Franklin had arranged their main campus building had burned down, and Franklin arranged for the New Deal agencies to finance a replacement building. So in January of 42, the President Hunter writes to Franklin and said, would you be interested? The house had been on the market for a while, and said, would you be interested in selling the house to Hunter to become a center for student groups? And Eleanor loved the idea, helped persuade Franklin not only to do it, he takes $10,000 off the $50,000 sale price to make it happen, donates $1,000 to buy books for the library, and then it becomes one of the first interreligious, it's basically all different social religious groups using that building, to the point where there'd be 500 students in there on a given night. But the building was in bad shape when it was sold because it was FDR's transition headquarters. So the media is camped out there. Frances Perkins famously writes in her book about coming to be interviewed to become the Secretary of Labor and the first female cabinet secretary. And she's talking about the house as a total wreck. The rugs are picked up. The reporters are camped out in the lobby. The furniture is all damaged. Because they're trying to get ready for the new administration. The house is like practically destroyed. And
they lived hard in places. I mean, they used them.
Yeah.
So they owned it and it was home, or business and home melded.
And Hunter restored it when they opened it to be the campus center, but then it got a lot of heavy use, and Hunter never really put the money into it, and it got to the point by 1992 that the stairways were falling off the walls, and the house was really could have been condemned, so they close it, and it could have been sold, it could have been demolished, and then Hunter gets the best possible president for Roosevelt House in the form of Jennifer Rabe, who had been the head of the New York City Landmarks Commission, and she had actually given grants to Hunter to help to start restoring the house, and she shows up and basically said, this house is a treasure, needs to be restored, be reused, convinced Governor Pataki and the Chancellor of the State University to do it, raises $25 million, and over 4 years, they totally restore the house. And the architects were brilliant. They said they need a room like this to do programs. So what they did is they excavated under the back lawn and used that space and the lower level where the kitchens and pantry and cold storage was to make a beautiful auditorium with the Franklin's For Freedom speech engraved on the back wall. And then they made a public policy center, which is still going strong.
So stepping back, Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, is an Oyster Bay, essentially, Roosevelt. And that her connections through that family are so expansive that it even amazes me when I look at the family tree, how that filters down and around through New York and cultural and political and civic affairs. So setting aside her father's story, which most of us know, he was an alcoholic and died at a young age. How did she interact with that family through her experience, apart from FDR, apart from him?
Well, TR always said that he was her favorite niece. And their wedding was arranged to be on St. Patty's Day because TR was coming up as president to oversee the parade. And actually, the letter is over in that special exhibit right now over in the library, where he says, he'd be thrilled to come and give her away. Of course, TR. What famous story, great story is TR being TR was always the center of attention. Whether he liked that, but even if he wasn't trying to be, couldn't help himself.
It's a big personality.
And even if he was trying to be step back out of the spotlight, everybody would seek him out. So when they're married, TR brings Eleanor down the aisle. They're married. They go off to have the reception, and almost everybody there follows TR into the reception room and ignores Eleanor and Franklin. And then Alice, TR's oldest daughter, later, if you know anything about her, she was famous for quips. And
quip is a polite word.
Yes. And reporters and everybody would gather around her because she always had something acerbic and funny to say. And then she comes out with the famous quote after the wedding saying, that her father wanted to be the corpse at every funeral and the bride and groom at every wedding. But the Oyster Bay Roosevelts doted on her, and she had a hard upbringing with her father dying young and her mother dying young, and it was a troubled family. So she not only did Theodore like her, Theodore's older sister Bammy basically took her under her wing, and Corinne, the other sister, would invite her to family gatherings when they were living in Jersey because they felt so bad for her. Corinne actually bought her a lot of fancy clothes in Paris because she thought she looked like sort of like a ragamuffin because her side of the family was not treating her well, not helping her have the kind of social outgoing nature that was expected of that class.
It's interesting you mentioned Corinne because also on exhibit over there is a Khalil Gibran book dedicated to ER in 1923. And we were trying to figure out how did that come about in 23. And it seems that Corinne was hosting parties and he would come and speak. And so ER was probably invited to some of those at times.
Yeah, well, she
was very had an artistic.
Yeah, but she was the big entertainer in the
Yeah.
family. She was like the quietest in the background growing up, and then when she marries Douglas Robinson, the financier, she kind of blossoms.
Yeah,
and it's funny because she almost didn't marry him because she kept comparing him to TR and her father, and wasn't sure that he matched. He matched up sufficiently. But the rest of the family said he's a nice guy. You should marry him, and she does.
A long and successful marriage.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's through the Alsops. The writers come through the Corinne line, don't they? Joe Alsop and those through there. It's all interconnected. I was looking at family trees, and it's hard enough to keep the Hyde Park Roosevelt straight in my head. I'm only gingerly going into the Oyster Bay.
Yeah, luckily for me and everybody else, John Gable, who was executive director of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, compiled a beautiful family tree, got everybody straight, and they actually did a multi-volume of their newsletter or their magazine with the whole family history. Every Roosevelt is in there explaining how they're all interrelated and their little bios. And it's like the Bible for anybody researching the Roosevelts.
I know that. That's good.
And what was cool is you'd go out with him to a family gathering and he'd sit there and say, oh, that's so-and-so, and give you the whole, he had it all in his head. He could tell you how everybody was interrelated just, from memory, which was pretty amazing.
And they're big families, and they do intermarry amongst their class and themselves so that the connections double back on one another sometimes, and it's complex. But it tells the story, though. What I find fascinating is it does tell a story of New York. It tells the New York story at that level. Its development, its social norms and constraints, and it also shows how people of means would shift their attention into the public sphere as well. So how did that occur on the Oyster Bay Roosevelt side?
Well, it was basically Theodore Sr.
Theodore Sr.
It was a combination of he had a great joyful life. He had a team of horses in a carriage. He'd go out and go galloping around Central Park. He liked to dress impeccably, eat nicely, but he had just incredible empathy for disadvantaged people. He got that a lot from his mother, Margaret, who married CVS. And when CVS marries her, she was a Quaker from Philadelphia. So this is the first marriage in the history of the family outside of the Dutch immigrant community. Everybody before them had married. Each Roosevelt would marry a Dutch American woman. And he met Margaret, and Margaret, as a Quaker and just by personality, said, if we're wealthy and important, we need to give it back. So CVS began to do that, and then TR Sr. turns that into a full-time job. During the Civil War, he didn't fight, which was because his wife was from Georgia, and she had relatives fighting for the Confederacy, and she begged him not to enlist like he wanted to fight for the Union. But then he goes on, he spends almost the entire war roaming around the country. He comes up with the idea, gets President Lincoln and Congress to form an allotment commission, which sets up the government department, basically, that allows soldiers to send money home to their families without putting dollar bills in their letters home. When he realizes that a lot of soldiers have been disabled and can't get employed, he creates an employment bureau to help them find jobs. but he roams around the city. He's sort of before Jacob Riis and Theodore Jr. are looking at the poor people. He's out there. He sees the newsboys out on the street day and night selling newspapers and realizing they're sleeping in the streets. So he helps build a newsboys' home for them to have a place to live. And it's cultural. It helps form the Metropolitan Opera. But Margaret plants the seed. Theodore Sr. really does that, and he wasn't interested in that. He was almost appointed to a government job, and then the politics got involved. He was supposed to be the collector of the port for New York City, and got in the middle of political infighting and was denied that. But he had really no interest in politics other than getting things done for charities. And then it's Theodore and then Franklin, who decide, they both go to law school, both decide they'd rather do politics than law. But
well, certainly FDR followed the roadmap that was TR's career, which is that fascinating, connection. And I think what's actually also too often more publicly as we talk about them as Republicans and Democrats is that, progressive bents perhaps differently applied, but nevertheless the notion of viewing the status quo as something that maybe isn't necessarily what's best to advance everyday people. They both sort of approach that both in terms of business different ways, but nevertheless within their times.
Yeah, well, I don't think there would have been a New Deal without without TR's model. The Square Deal becomes the New Deal.
Yeah. So, well, I think now if anyone has any questions, we would probably to the microphone over here. If not, we'll just keep going. Everyone's shy tonight, so they're shy. All right, well.
They have one back there.
Oh. Thanks.
We're going to put you on the spot.
We're just pulling you up here.
Literally.
Can you tell me who Sarah Delano Roosevelt was from the 1850s? I have a lot of ephemera from a world tour that they took, an entourage.
Basically, she marries James Roosevelt, who is much older than she is, and what a lot of people don't realize is the Delanos were more prominent and richer than the Roosevelts. So when she marries into the Roosevelt family, some people on her side of the family thought she was marrying down, beneath
some
her
of the
stature.
Roosevelts also would have thought, well, the Delanos are kind of in the trade, perhaps.
Yeah, but she traveled widely, did what wealthy people would do in her era.
So how was she related to Teddy or?
Oh, well, she was the president's mother. President Franklin Roosevelt's mother.
Yeah, she was she marries into the Hyde Park branch.
And she was, the ephemera I have is from 1850.
She was born, she was born in 1850 something because she lived till 1941 and she was almost 90 when she died.
So when was he born? What year?
The president was born in 1882.
Okay. All right. So I have all this stuff from her.
But basically, when she marries James, they have the one son, Franklin, and that becomes her whole life pretty much for the rest of her life.
Okay.
Although she's involved in causes. They invite black civil rights leaders to the townhouse in Manhattan, and both Eleanor and Sarah get involved in helping to fund a college for black women in Florida.
Yeah, she really married down. Thank you.
Anyone? That brings up the question too. We talk about the Roosevelts, of course, but those families intermarried through the maternal lines. We rarely talk necessarily about those lines. Up here, we have any number of people that go all the way back to the Dutch Pattons up here, the Beekman, just to the north of here, and on the on the Theodore Roosevelt side and on the Oyster Bay side, who were some of those maternal families within? Were they New York prominent families? Were they, because you mentioned she married a Quaker from Philadelphia? That's unusual to me, even to think about the Hyde Park Roosevelts. That's a very different kind of marriage.
Yeah. Well, Elliot marries into a very prominent real estate family.
She was a Hall, correct?
Yeah, the Halls. Trying to think of any other
I'll put you on
example.
the spot, and I apologize.
Yeah.
I'm asking about matrilineal lines, and it's just not fair.
I mean, and not all of them did that. TR's younger daughter marries a local doctor in Oyster Bay. So I mean, it wasn't like the Gilded Age where they had to marry for money or prestige. I mean, they really married whoever they wanted.
And they were wealthy, but they weren't Vanderbilt wealthy.
Well, what happened was, I mean, like Cornelius was the richest, one of the first millionaire in the city, but he divides the money up among 5 sons, 4 sons, because one of them had died. And a lot of them continued in business, but because Theodore Sr. really was bored with the business and not interested, he gave away most of the family's money. So when he dies, what he hadn't given away was split among the 4 siblings, and they weren't wealthy. I mean, TR was when he marries. There's a great story that when he marries the second time after Alice Lee dies. I don't know, you may have heard that story. His mother and his first wife die on Valentine's Day on the same day, 1884, I think it was, or 86. But he marries his childhood best friend, Edith Carew. They're so poor when they move into Sagamore Hill. She's making candles at one point, which is sort of like Martha Washington making candles. It's kind of mind-boggling. But Theodore Sr. had given away so much money and then was divided. And anybody else in their social class would have a big house in the city and a country house up here, Oyster Bay. TR was so poor when he got out of Harvard, and he decides the only house he can afford is Sagamore Hill and Oyster Bay. And when he's in New York, he stays with his older sister Bammy or other relatives. And they were so poor, and they would have probably lost the house, except Edith was a world-class money manager, and TR was a spendthrift. She would give Theodore a $20 bill every day for spending money, and by dinner it was gone. And when she would ask him where he'd spent the money, he couldn't even remember. So she and it was a working farm, so she managed the household, she managed the servants, she managed the farm, and kept them barely afloat. But in some of their letters to relatives, they're talking about money is so tight that they might have to sell Sagamore Hill. And it's only later when he starts to write best-selling books like the Naval War of 1812 that enough money is coming in that they're comfortable. But they were never rich, even before or after the White House. I mean, they were.
And that's fascinating with the bigger families, because in the Hudson Valley, once Mr. James had his first son by his first wife who died, and of course he married an Astor, so he was comfortably off. And the president was an only child. His mother was from a huge family. The Delanos were very wealthy, though, very, very wealthy. So there weren't as many people to divide the money up among.
Right, and they didn't have a Theodore Sr. who wanted to give it all away.
No, Mr. James didn't give everything away.
Yeah, I mean, if he had stayed in the business and invested like James and other relatives, they would have been extremely wealthy, because there was a lot of money in the family, and he just couldn't give it away fast enough.
Well, thank you for being here tonight. We really appreciate it coming up. We don't talk about Theodore Roosevelt enough up here at this library, and we should. And on exhibit right now, as you mentioned, we have a couple of letters specifically related to their marriage, or actually one of them is FDR going to visit them in the 1890s when he's a teenager. Right. So, which is fascinating, because we often think of him only through the connection through ER in that way, and this preceded that. Family, they're all interconnected, and they kept track of it, didn't they? Very much so. Well, thank you, and I would invite everyone to stay and for book signing.
Yes,
Thank you very
Bill.
much.
Thank you all for coming.